A horrifying crime that shook a small Pennsylvania town and has never been solved. 62 years ago this week, 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty was murdered inside a Catholic church just steps from her home in Bristol, a suburb of Philadelphia. Despite the efforts of investigators, to this day, her killer has never been found. But the case is getting some added attention thanks to a new podcast, whose host is a well-known voice in a very different arena.
Oh, good morning, everybody. It is the Mike Missinelli Show. What a day we're going to have today.
Mike Missinelli has been a fixture on Philadelphia sports talk radio for more than 30 years.
This is a way for you to stick up for Nick Sirianni? This is a backdoor way for you to give Sirianni a compliment?
Each morning, he squares off with the notoriously tough Philly sports fans.
That's a bully. He's taking any second.
Not taking a bullet. Did you see the conversation he had with his quarterback?
And offers his own unvarnished opinions on the city's teams.
That's coming up. And also, our continued analysis of the Philadelphia Eagles winning yesterday, in spite of the coach. How was DNA collected back then? And obviously it wasn't as scientific as it is today.
But now he's lending his voice to a different and far more consequential effort. Over the summer, Missinelli launched The Coldest Murder, a podcast he hopes will untangle the mystery of who killed Carol Ann Dougherty 62 years ago. The case shocked the close-knit town of Bristol Borough, Pennsylvania. For Missinelli, who grew up in Bristol, the mission is personal.
Why did you want to do this podcast?
When something traumatic like that happens in a little town like this that is so unexpected, it stays with you for a really long time. And the fact that this has been a cold case for 60 plus years really weighed on me. It was just heartbreak for the town. And I just remember the town. It was like you hit this town with a stun gun when it happened, and things were different, and it wasn't the same freedom, and everybody was afraid. There was a murderer on the loose.
On an October evening in 1962, Dougherty's body was found by her father under a stained glass window in the choir loft of St. Mark's Catholic Church. She had been raped and strangled. The fifth grader had stopped in to say a prayer, just as the nuns at her school instructed her to do when passing by a church. Dougherty's prized bicycle still outside what was now a murder scene.
I was standing on that part. My brother was at the end of the yard, and we were throwing a football, and my mother came out of that side door, racing down the steps to get to right there, so to get us into the house.
Wow. Around 7 years old at the time, Missinelli remembers playing outside his house when the news hit. His uncle, Vincent Faragalli, was Bristol's police chief.
He called my mother to say something bad happened in this church. Get the children in the house, because he didn't know if the murderer was in my neighborhood.
The case haunted his uncle for the rest of his life.
But he kept a picture of Carol Ann on his bureau to remind him, and it was gut-wrenching for him. We were afraid to look up.
And it weighs on Missinelli to this day.
Every time I walked through this church, the hairs on my arm would stand up.
Yeah.
I remember vividly, and I would never want to look up. Even back then,
yeah, you're not even 7 yet.
We had 2 newspapers delivered to our house, and I would always look at the headlines and try to read the stories. And I saw these splashy stories about a girl being murdered in a church, and it just shook me as a little kid. That image stayed with me for a really long time.
Investigators keyed in on 4 main suspects, but now believe it comes down to 2. Father Joseph Sabatish, St. Mark's pastor, who would later face accusations of molesting children, and William Schrader, a drifter living near the church at the time, who was convicted of manslaughter in Louisiana decades later.
Both of them were spotted in the area at the time of the crime. The priest was spotted at the commercial street, and Schrader was spotted in the area near the church and lied about his alibi. But they just didn't have enough evidence to hold him.
You drive him around town, and they told us he was pointing things out. But anytime they mentioned the murder, he said, I plead the fifth.
On The Coldest Murder, Missinelli speaks with people connected to the case, including a relative of one of the suspects.
Before killing the kid out of cold blood, committing murder like that? No.
And most recently, Dougherty's sister, Kay.
They had a picture of them bringing Carol's body out of the church. The first thing that hit me was, she must have been so cold.
The only thing left to solve this case is a matchup of DNA.
Miss Anelli believes the answer to this case, like so many others, lies in DNA evidence.
At this point, it's a matter of going forward and going through these very expensive tests to find out where they can match this DNA. And again, we're talking about a cold case for 62 years. How much resources can they actually dedicate to that?
But now, those tests will happen. Investigators announced this month they will submit DNA evidence believed to be from the killer to a Texas lab that specializes in cold case murders.
We have a pretty good sense of who we believe is responsible.
Jennifer Shorn is the Bucks County, Pennsylvania district attorney.
What role, if any, did his podcast play in where you are now?
So it's interesting. I mean, the media has been so helpful, to help us solve cases. So I credit what Mike is doing. It's fascinating, and his perspective as a 7-year-old who personally recalls the collateral consequences that the community felt and suffered with Carol Ann's heinous murder.
But Shorn cautions the tests may prove inconclusive.
Unfortunately, there's no guarantee. It will really depend upon the quality of the specimens we're sending, and I hope we'll know sooner than later.
Have you thought about the possibility that you test this DNA evidence and it exonerates both of them?
And there's some mystery
and there's some
murderer.
mystery DNA out there.
That would be unfortunate.
Yeah.
Because I've done a lot of work on focusing on these two. I can't imagine that there would be some mystery person who would be able to elude authorities and elude suspicion and attention all these years.
Right.
But if it is, that might make everybody sadder.
Still, Miss Anelli remains hopeful that the mystery of who killed Carol Ann Dougherty will soon be solved.
This is a really good little town, and that it's left a stain on this town that I kind of want to, it's not going to remove it, but I think people feel better about getting closure about who actually committed this crime.
We talk about how long this might take. It could take up to a year. It depends the viability of that DNA evidence. And again, you go back, it wasn't preserved because we didn't know about DNA evidence in that way, the things that they're looking at. Should point out both suspects are dead. This really is about closure, not just for Carol Ann's sister who spoke on the podcast there, but somebody like Mike. I met some of his friends in the town. They all still remember it so well. It impacted all of them at such a young age.
How could you forget? I just find it interesting. You launched this piece before the news of the test going forward with the test.
Right, and he was talking about the podcast. The investigation was always ongoing, and it was a cold case, and they were still trying to find things. It's exactly what the DA said. This podcast has kept it in the conversation and kept it alive, and it's wonderful that it's at least now has the potential to find some closure.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that.